In the crime-ridden city of Blackridge, the Crimson Fangs gang controls everything with fear and violence, until they meet Dr. Evelyn Rourke, a seemingly quiet nurse with a dark past. When the gang targets her clinic and intimidates her elderly patients, they don't know that Evelyn is a former combat medic, trained to survive and fight back. One encounter in the clinic changes everything, and soon she becomes the gang's worst nightmare. As Evelyn fights back, using her military skills to dismantle their empire, she faces dangerous foes and unimaginable odds. But will she survive long enough to take them down? Join us on Voices of the Underdog for this gripping tale of courage and survival. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. The air in Blackridge always carried a heavy weight, something unspoken, something oppressive. It was the kind of city where silence wasn't peace. It was tension, waiting for the next explosion. The streets bore the marks of old fights, their asphalt cracked like the bones of those who had dared to challenge the wrong people. And at the heart of it all, the Crimson Fangs ruled. They weren't just another street gang. They were an empire built on fear and violence, their influence stretching into every alley, every business, every life. The police either looked the other way or were too scared to act. Those who resisted them didn't last long. But if the Crimson Fangs were the disease that festered in Blackridge, then Horizon Medical Clinic was the last operating sanctuary, a place where victims of the city's brutality came to be patched up, given a chance to keep going, even if the fight was hopeless. And Dr. Evelyn Rourke had made it her battlefield. The clinic, a place of resistance. Evelyn moved through the small clinic with practiced efficiency, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she checked on patients. Even after years of civilian life, she still carried herself like a soldier, rigid posture, precise movements, and ever-present readiness for conflict. Tonight, like every other night, the waiting room was full of people nursing wounds they refused to explain. A young man with a split lip and swollen knuckles, a woman with dark bruises circling her wrist like iron shackles, a boy no older than 16, his ribs bandaged after what he claimed was a fall down the stairs. Lies. All of them. Evelyn knew the signs of systematic violence better than most. She had spent years stitching up soldiers on the battlefield, watching men bleed out from wounds they never saw coming. This was no different. These weren't accidents. They were warnings, punishments, reminders that Blackridge belonged to the Crimson Fangs. She finished wrapping a patient's arm and let out a slow breath. How much longer before the clinic itself became a target? The thought was interrupted by a sound outside. Raised voices, the sharp edge of hostility slicing through the night air. Evelyn glanced at Dr. Marcus Ellison, her longtime friend and clinic co-owner. His expression mirrored hers, tension, concern. This wasn't unusual, but something about the tone of those voices set her on edge. Then she heard a name. Daniel Vega. The incident. Evelyn was moving before she even registered the thought. Her instincts, honed by war and survival, drove her toward the front door. Outside, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, stood Daniel Vega, one of her regular patients, an elderly man confined to a wheelchair after a workplace accident years ago. He was one of the lucky ones. He had survived the city's brutality, but survival came at a cost. And now, that cost had caught up to him. 3 men loomed over Daniel, their body language dripping with predatory amusement. Their red-marked jackets bore the unmistakable insignia of the Crimson Fangs. "Come on, old man," one of them sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "You've been late on your payments. You know how this works." Daniel's voice trembled, but he forced himself to remain steady. "I told you I don't have it." "Wrong answer." The leader of the group, A broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar running from his jaw to his ear leaned down, gripping the handles of Daniel's wheelchair. "Maybe we take something else then. How about a lesson?" That was when Evelyn stepped in. "Let him go." The gang members turned in unison, their amusement deepening when they saw her, a woman in scrubs. This was almost too easy. The scarred man cocked his head. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Evelyn didn't answer. She simply took a slow step forward, her expression unreadable. Another man laughed. "Lady, this isn't your business. Go back inside and play nurse, unless you want to play something else for us." Before he could finish the sentence, Evelyn moved. The first man never saw it coming. Evelyn sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted, a brutal, practiced motion that dislocated his elbow in a sickening pop. He screamed, stumbling back, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The second man reacted, swinging wildly at her. She ducked, stepped into his guard, and drove her knee into his ribs, twice. He gasped, doubling over just in time for her to hook his legs and send him sprawling to the pavement. The third, Scarface, hesitated. He had underestimated her. Big mistake. Evelyn didn't wait for him to move. She launched herself forward, slamming her elbow into his throat, cutting off his breath. As he staggered, she grabbed the front of his jacket, yanked him forward, and whispered, "I don't repeat myself." Then she drove him face first into the side of a parked car. Silence. The only sound was the labored breathing of the injured men and Daniel Vega's whispered, "Jesus Christ." Evelyn exhaled, rolling her shoulders. The fight was over. For now, she turned to Daniel. "You okay?" The old man nodded, though his hands still trembled. "They're going to come back." "I know." She looked down at the crumpled bodies around her, then back toward the clinic. This wasn't over. The Crimson Fangs didn't forgive. They didn't forget. And now she had made herself a target, but that was fine. Evelyn Rourke had fought worse battles, and she wasn't afraid of war. The silence was the first warning. Blackridge was never truly quiet. Even in the dead of night, there was always the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shouts from dark alleyways, the ever-present heartbeat of a city that never slept. But tonight, the air outside Horizon Medical Clinic felt different, too still, too expectant, like the city itself was holding its breath. Dr. Evelyn Rourke stood outside her clinic, the dim glow of a flickering streetlight casting long shadows around her. The scent of antiseptic and old wood from inside the clinic clashed with the acrid stench of spray paint still lingering in the air. The words were bold, red, and violent. "Know your place," scrawled across the front windows, an unmistakable signature of the Crimson Fangs. Glass crunched beneath her boots as she stepped forward, surveying the damage. The front window had been smashed in. Shards of glass littered the pavement, reflecting the streetlights like 1,000 tiny warning signals. Her clinic, the one thing standing between this city and its slow, suffocating decay, had been violated. She should have expected this. She did expect this. But it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Behind her, a familiar voice broke the silence. "They're not going to stop." Evelyn turned to see Dr. Marcus Ellison, his arms crossed, his face tight with frustration. He had been with her since the beginning, running the clinic side by side, but now his usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something close to fear. "This isn't just a warning," he continued, his voice low. "This is them marking us, marking you, and you damn well know it." Evelyn met his gaze evenly. "I know." "Then why the hell aren't you scared?" She was. She just didn't have the luxury of showing it. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Eve, listen to me. This isn't like some street thug shaking down a shopkeeper. Lucas Red Mercer runs this city. He's not just a gang leader. He's got half the cops in his pocket, business owners under his thumb, and enough bodies in unmarked graves to remind people why they don't fight back. And you just humiliated his men in the middle of the street. You think he's going to let that slide?" No. Marcus took a deep breath, his frustration giving way to something heavier. Then stop, before we lose everything. Evelyn glanced at the clinic, at the broken glass, at the threats painted in blood-red letters. They wanted her afraid. They wanted her weak. They wanted her to fall in line like everyone else. I'm not stopping. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course you're not. Before he could argue further, the sharp wail of a police siren split the night. The black, unmarked sedan rolled up slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. The door swung open, and out stepped Detective Carter Hayes, one of the last good cops in a city where good didn't mean much. He was tall, lean, and perpetually exhausted, his rumpled blazer hanging off his frame like he had been wearing it for days. His eyes, sharp and observant, flickered between the vandalized clinic and Evelyn. "Hell of a mess," he said, walking over. "I assume this is your doing." Evelyn arched a brow. "Because I like spray painting my own clinic." Hayes smirked, but there was no humor in it. "No, because you picked a fight with the biggest shark in the water, and now the sharks are circling." She crossed her arms. "I didn't pick a fight, I protected my patient." Hayes exhaled sharply, glancing at Marcus. "And look where it got you." Marcus gestured toward the clinic. "She won't listen." Hayes didn't look surprised. She never does. He turned back to Evelyn, his expression hardening. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, you already made your choice, but I need you to understand exactly what's coming." "I'm listening." "Lucas Mercer doesn't do warnings. This," he gestured to the shattered windows, the blood-red graffiti, "this is just the beginning. The next move, they come for your people, your patients, your staff, then they come for you." Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. "I can handle myself." Hayes studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of." And then, as if the night hadn't delivered enough reminders, Evelyn's phone buzzed in her pocket. A call from an unknown number. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because just down the street someone screamed. Evelyn ran. She didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. She turned the corner and froze. Daniel Viga's wheelchair was tipped over, its wheels spinning uselessly against the pavement. His body lay motionless, his throat slit so deep that his head was nearly severed. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and final. Above his body, scrawled in the same red paint, was a message even colder than the last. "Stay in your lane." Evelyn's stomach twisted, her heart slamming against her ribs as the world narrowed. Daniel had been an old man, a survivor, a man who had already lost everything once. And now he was nothing more than a message. Footsteps approached behind her, but she didn't turn. Marcus gasped when he saw the body, his breath hitching in horror. Hayes, ever the cop, merely sighed, his shoulders slumping as he ran a hand through his hair. "Jesus Christ, Evelyn," Marcus whispered. Hayes crouched near the body, his expression unreadable. "They made it personal." Evelyn barely heard them. Her blood pounded in her ears, drowning out everything but the weight of the moment. This was no longer about a clinic, no longer about defending a few patients, no longer about trying to keep her head down and play by the rules. They had declared war, and Evelyn Rourke was going to answer. Dominic Hayes adjusted his tie as he walked through the corridors of Hayes Freight Solutions headquarters, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. The boardroom was already filling up when he arrived. The long glass table, polished to a mirror sheen, was surrounded by some of the most powerful figures in the company, men and women in tailored suits, people who had spent years analyzing spreadsheets but had never once stepped inside a warehouse or driven a freight truck. And he had no intention of losing. Lisa Carter, the company's CFO and one of the few executives Dominic truly trusted, sat beside him. She gave him a slight nod, a silent confirmation that she had run the numbers, prepared the projections, and anticipated every possible rebuttal. Across the table sat Elliot Mercer, one of the company's largest investors, a man who measured success in quarterly earnings and cared little for anything beyond profit margins. His arms were crossed, his expression already skeptical. Beside him was Margaret Sinclair, a seasoned board member in her 60s. Unlike Mercer, she wasn't outright hostile, but she had a reputation for being careful, calculated, and unwilling to take risks that might threaten investor confidence. Dominic took his seat at the head of the table and let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he began. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic said, his voice steady, "we need to talk about the people who keep this company running." Elliot Mercer let out a quiet sigh, already unimpressed. "We compensate our employees fairly," Mercer interrupted. "I don't see why." "No, we don't." The room fell silent. Dominic looked each board member in the eye before continuing. "Last night I saw one of our best employees, someone who works more hours than almost anyone else, taking food home from the company cafeteria because she couldn't afford a meal," Dominic stated. "She has 2 kids, no furniture, and no way of knowing if she'll be able to feed them tomorrow." Margaret Sinclair shifted slightly in her seat. Elliot, however, looked unimpressed. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but it's not our problem. We're running a business, not a charity." Dominic expected that response. "No," he agreed. "We're running a business, and let me tell you exactly why this is our problem." He tapped on the folder in front of him, Lisa's report. "We are bleeding money on employee turnover," Dominic continued. "The costs of constantly hiring, training, and losing workers are eating into our profits faster than any wage increase ever could." Lisa took over, flipping open a color-coded spreadsheet of financial breakdowns. "In the past year alone," she said, "Hayes Freight Solutions has spent millions replacing employees who left due to unsustainable work conditions and low pay. The costs associated with rehiring and training exceed what we would spend increasing wages and benefits in the first place." Margaret Sinclair frowned, studying the numbers. Elliot, however, wasn't convinced. "Turnover is part of the industry," he dismissed. "This is logistics, not a tech company. People come and go." Dominic leaned forward. "Then tell me, Elliot," he said coolly, "how do you expect to keep this company afloat when our workforce no longer wants to work for us?" That shut Mercer up for the moment. Dominic turned to the rest of the board. "My proposal is simple," he continued. "A real wage increase, not just pennies to keep up with inflation. Better health care options. Child care assistance for employees struggling to balance work and family. And an emergency financial aid program, because no employee who gives their all to this company should have to beg for food at the end of the day." A murmur swept across the room. Some of the board members exchanged uncertain glances. Margaret tapped a pen against the table. "And how do you plan to fund all this?" she asked. Dominic already knew this was coming, and so he did the one thing that none of them expected. He leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice calm and deliberate. "If necessary," he said, "I'll take a personal pay cut to make this happen." The room fell into stunned silence. Lisa's eyes snapped toward him, clearly surprised, but she didn't say a word. Elliot Mercer sat forward, frowning. "Are you serious?" Dominic held his gaze unwavering. "I built this company," he said, his voice firm, unshaken. "If we fail, it's on me, but I'm telling you now, we won't fail." He gestured toward the financial reports Lisa had prepared. "This isn't just the right thing to do," Dominic said. "It's a strategic decision, a long-term investment in employee loyalty, retention, and company growth." Margaret Sinclair studied him carefully, her expression thoughtful. Across the table, a few of the other board members whispered amongst themselves, rethinking their positions. Finally, Margaret let out a breath and pushed the report back toward Lisa. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time we start thinking about more than just the next quarter." "I vote yes." A small victory. One by one, the votes fell into place, not unanimous, not without resistance, but enough. Dominic sat back, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. As the meeting adjourned, Lisa walked beside Dominic as they exited the boardroom. "When you said you were serious," she muttered under her breath, "I didn't think you meant your own damn salary." Dominic let out a low breath. "It worked, didn't it?" Lisa shook her head, but he caught the small smirk she tried to hide. "Yeah," she admitted. "It did." They stopped near the elevators, the hum of the office filling the space around them. Beyond the glass walls, employees moved through their day, loading shipments, answering calls, keeping the company alive in ways the board would never truly understand. Dominic watched them, his jaw set, his conviction solid. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. This wasn't just about Isabella. This was about all of them. Every worker who had ever pulled a double shift, every driver who had ever missed a holiday, every person who had ever worked themselves to exhaustion just to survive. For years, he had believed hard work was the key to success. He still did. But now he believed in something more. Lisa crossed her arms. "So now that we've got approval," she said, raising an eyebrow, "who's telling the employees?" Dominic exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "I am." Lisa looked at him for a beat, then smirked. "This is gonna be a shock." "Yeah," Dominic said, already stepping forward. "And I want them to hear it from me." The air in Blackridge had always smelled of smoke and corruption, but now it stung, like something rotten had been ripped open for everyone to see. Evelyn Rourke had spent years fighting battles in places where the rules didn't exist, where life and death were measured in seconds. But this city played by a different set of rules, and the people who ran it had spent decades making sure no one could win against them. She had stolen Mercer's money, dismantled his operations, and survived an ambush that should have killed her. But now she knew the truth. Mercer wasn't the top of the food chain. Councilman Gerald Sutton was. The tip-off had come from Detective Carter Hayes, though he never said it outright. He never could. It was late, past midnight, when he showed up at her safe house, his face carved with exhaustion and his eyes heavier than usual. "You think you're fighting a gang," he said, standing in her doorway. "You're not." Evelyn studied him, silent, waiting. Hayes stepped inside, closing the door behind him like he was hiding from something. "Mercer's just a pawn," he said. "Always has been. You really think a guy like him could hold onto this much power this long without someone bigger backing him?" Evelyn exhaled. "Who?" Hayes didn't answer. Not with words. He just pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the table between them. Evelyn opened it. Inside were bank records, wire transfers, confidential emails, and at the center of it all, Councilman Gerald Sutton. Sutton wasn't just protecting Mercer, he was funding him. He kept the cops off his back, made sure the courts never ruled against him, and lined his own pockets with Crimson Fang's profits. And when Evelyn pushed too hard, he pushed back. Harder. The next morning, Horizon Medical Clinic was shut down. Health code violations, funding freezes, permit revocations, all of it fabricated. A bureaucratic death sentence. Evelyn arrived just as city officials were boarding up the entrance, a group of armed police officers standing nearby, their faces blank. Marcus was already there, arguing with one of the inspectors. "This is bullshit," he snapped. "You know damn well this clinic is the only thing keeping people alive in this city." The inspector didn't even look at him, just signed the final closure order. "This isn't up for discussion." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice low and sharp. "Who gave the order?" The inspector hesitated. For a split second, his eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe, but then his face hardened. "This decision was made at the city level," Marcus scoffed. "Sutton." The inspector didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. The suppliers cut them off. Every vendor, every distributor, every medical partner. Overnight, they refused to sell Horizon Medical so much as a box of gauze. Evelyn made calls. No one answered. The ones who did, Their voices shook with fear. "I'm sorry, Dr. Rourke. We can't risk doing business with you anymore." That same day, Dr. Marcus Ellison left. Evelyn found him packing his office, his movements stiff, his face lined with frustration. "I can't do this anymore, Eve," he said, shoving a pile of medical journals into a duffel bag. "We lost." Evelyn stood in the doorway, unmoving. "That's what they want you to think," he exhaled. "No, that's the truth. We can't fight an entire system. We're not just going up against a gang anymore. We're going up against the city itself." Evelyn clenched her jaw. "So you're running?" Marcus turned to face her. "No, I'm surviving. You should think about doing the same." She didn't argue, because deep down she knew he was right. The city had turned against her, and now she was completely alone. Evelyn stood in front of the ruins of her clinic that night. The neon sign, once a beacon in the darkness, was dark. The doors locked and abandoned. The place she had spent years building gone, because she had dared to fight back. And yet she felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, not regret, just clarity. This had never been about the clinic. It had never even been about Lucas Mercer. This was about the corruption that had poisoned Blackridge for decades. This was about every person who had been crushed under its weight. They thought shutting her down would stop her. They thought she would walk away. They thought they had won. But what Sutton didn't understand, what Mercer and his men had failed to realize, was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because now, Evelyn Rourke wasn't just fighting for a clinic. She was fighting to burn their entire empire to the ground. She didn't have an army, she didn't have resources, she didn't even have backup anymore, but she still had one thing: the truth, and she was going to use it. Evelyn picked up the envelope Hayes had given her, flipping through the documents one last time. Bank records, wire transfers, bribes, corrupt deals, all leading back to Councilman Sutton. She grabbed her jacket, pocketed the envelope, and stepped into the streets. Because if Sutton thought he could bury his sins in the shadows, she was about to drag them into the light. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that settled in your bones before a fight, before blood was spilled, before something irreversible happened. Evelyn Rourke stood in the shadows of the abandoned Hawthorne factory, the cold steel beams stretching high above like the bones of a long-dead beast. The factory had been shut down for years, forgotten like so much of Blackridge, left to rust and decay in the city's emptied-out corners. But tonight it was a battlefield. She had chosen it carefully, isolated, away from civilians, with plenty of places to set traps. She couldn't take on Lucas Mercer and Tobias Briggs in a straight fight, not when they would bring dozens of men to kill her. So she made sure that when they arrived, they would be walking into a graveyard. Evelyn spent the last 48 hours rigging the factory with military precision. She had learned in war zones that firepower wasn't everything, strategy was. She set up tripwires along key hallways, connected to homemade smoke bombs, enough to disorient anyone who triggered them. Booby-trapped stairwells, forcing them to take a single, predictable route. Explosives under weak flooring, designed to collapse under weight, taking enemies down into the lower levels. Sniper perches, giving her visibility over the entire layout. She wasn't here to fight fair. She was here to end this. Evelyn had leaked just enough information for Mercer to take the bait. She made it look like she was on the run, that she had been cornered and desperate, hiding out in the abandoned factory. The news spread fast because it was meant to, and just as expected, Mercer took the bait. They came in heavily armed, at least a dozen men led by Tobias "Tide" Briggs himself. The enforcer strode through the factory entrance like a warlord, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hands twitching by his holster. Mercer, however, wasn't there yet. He never showed up to a fight, only the aftermath. Briggs and his men moved in, sweeping the area, but Evelyn was already in position, hidden, waiting. The first trap triggered. A tripwire snapped, releasing a burst of blinding smoke that filled the air. The men coughed, stumbling, their vision obscured, just as she had planned. Evelyn struck fast. She dropped from the rafters, taking out 2 men in seconds, her blade slicing through one's throat while she crushed another's knee with a brutal kick. Chaos erupted. Gunfire rang through the empty space, echoing against steel walls. She ducked, weaving between rusted machinery, using her traps to funnel them where she wanted. One misstep. A man sprinted across the wrong section of flooring, and the explosives beneath detonated, sending him plummeting into the darkness below. One by one they fell, until it was just her and Briggs. Briggs cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders, his smile dark and hungry. "You've been a real pain in the ass, Rourke." Evelyn exhaled, rolling out the tension in her muscles. "You're going to have to do better than that, Tide." And then he charged. Briggs fought like a wrecking ball, throwing his entire body weight into every punch, every strike meant to break bone. Evelyn dodged the first swing, pivoting around him, quick and precise. She slammed her elbow into his ribs, but he barely flinched. He was too big, too strong. He grabbed her by the collar and threw her against the wall. The impact stole her breath, pain radiating through her back. She barely had time to recover before he was on her again, his fists moving fast, brutal, relentless. She twisted, barely avoiding a devastating punch to her skull. Briggs laughed. "Damn, Rourke, you really think you can win this?" She gritted her teeth, waiting, watching. Briggs relied on power, but he was reckless, and he had just made his biggest mistake. He overextended. Evelyn seized the moment, ducked under his next swing, locked his arm, and twisted with everything she had. A sickening pop echoed through the room. Briggs screamed as his shoulder dislocated, his balance faltering. She didn't hesitate. She drove her knee into his gut, knocking him down, and then, one final, precise strike, she slammed his skull into the concrete floor. Briggs went still, unconscious, defeated. As the dust settled, a slow clap echoed through the factory. Lucas Mercer stepped out of the shadows. He was calm, collected, dressed in a dark, tailored suit, looking completely out of place in the wreckage of the battlefield. He smirked. "You really are something else, Dr. Rourke." Evelyn wiped the blood from her lips, breathing heavily. "This is over, Mercer." He raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pistol. "Let's be smart about this," he said, tilting his head. "We both know how this ends. You walk away now, and I make sure no one ever comes after you again. Hell, I'll even pay you to disappear." Evelyn exhaled. "You really think I'd take your money?" Mercer's smirk widened. "Everyone has a price." She stepped forward. "Not me." And then she moved. Mercer fired, but she was faster. She dodged, closing the distance before he could get off another shot. She grabbed his wrist, twisting the gun away, and slammed her fist into his ribs. Mercer stumbled, shock flickering across his face. He wasn't used to losing. He swung wildly, but Evelyn caught his arm, using his own momentum to flip him onto the ground. He gasped, winded, struggling. For the first time, he looked afraid. Evelyn knelt beside him, pressing the barrel of his own gun against his temple. One pull of the trigger, that's all it would take. Mercer stared at her, waiting, daring her. "Do it," he hissed. She stared back, and then she lowered the gun. "You don't deserve an easy way out," she murmured. At that moment, sirens howled in the distance. Detective Carter Hayes and his team arrived. Evelyn stood, stepping back as officers rushed in, dragging Mercer to his feet. His empire had collapsed, his gang destroyed, his power gone. And for the first time, Lucas Mercer had lost. With Mercer behind bars, Crimson Fangs fell apart overnight. Councilman Gerald Sutton was exposed, his corruption laid bare for the world to see. Horizon Medical Clinic was restored, but Evelyn knew her war was over. Blackridge didn't need her anymore, so she left. With nothing but a bag on her back, she walked away from the city she had nearly burned down. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten: freedom.